Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the Liberty Report. I'm Daniel McAdams. I'll be hosting the show today because Dr. Paul is out of town. If you follow the show, and especially if you follow the Ron Paul Institute, which I'm the director of, you know that one of our favorite things to talk about is the neocons, and the neocons' stranglehold on foreign policy, their stranglehold on Washington, how they've been able to frame the issue that everyone who doesn't agree with them is extreme, and they are the mainstream, whereas in fact they are probably the most extreme people on earth. Well, we're very fortunate today to be joined by a filmmaker who I just came aware of his film. He has a 3-part documentary series called A Very Heavy Agenda. He sent me a link to the first 2 installments a couple of weeks ago, and I sat down and was blown away for 2 or 3 hours. They're long films, but they're fascinating films. Robbie Martin is the director, producer, filmmaker of these films. Robbie, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Daniel.
Well, thanks for making these films. One of the things I think is most important about the 2 episodes I've seen so far, and the 3rd installment is coming out this month. We'll talk about that later. But what's important is, in my opinion, is it focuses on the continuity of the neocons in Washington. No matter who is sitting at the throne of the presidency, the neocons are there to give advice, to whisper in the ear. And so yours was a non-ideological film. You didn't want to just attack Bush or just attack Obama, the Democrats or Republicans. And I think it made it for a very powerful film. But I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, if you can recap the first 2 films. Just sort of the main idea of what the plot is, what the films are about, so the readers can get a little bit of a flavor.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, going off of what you just said, sort of in the intro there about how, a lot of the times when people make movies like this, they are maybe more partisan tinged, or they're about Bush. I mean, even the film The Power of Nightmares, that's mostly about the neoconservative influence, is mostly about the Bush administration and the people that were in his inner circle. So a very heavy agenda in a very basic sense. All 3 parts of the film are specifically focusing in on who I consider some of the most influential neoconservatives in D.C. And, names like Richard Pearl and Michael Ledeen would probably come to mind for most people when you talk about most influential. But I think what they didn't succeed with, people like William Crystal and Robert Kagan did succeed with, which is actually rebranding neoconservatism to be something that has some sort of bipartisan appeal, that it can actually influence both sides of the political spectrum. And A Very Heavy Agenda Part 1 kind of recaps what the Project for the New American Century actually was, what they wrote, who was part of it, not just who signed their letters, because people like Jeb Bush, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, they did sign the PNAC letters, but they weren't the people who actually were writing a lot of the policy. It wasn't them. It was people like Robert Kagan, people like Donald Kagan, and even Robert Kagan's brother, Fred Kagan. So in part 1, it kind of shows how after the Bush administration ended, these neocons in D.C. realized that they needed to sort of try to reach out to the other side of the aisle, the Democrats, and to take a less partisan approach than they had before. And I tried to show that a little bit in part 1, but mostly part 1 is showing how they didn't go away. The Project for the New American Century, when it closed, it didn't simply disappear. It actually reopened under the name the Foreign Policy Initiative. And that was sort of the purpose of part 1. And in part 2, I start right back off at the point where the Foreign Policy Initiative is now, the new neocon think tank that they've created. And the Obama administration is now in office. And through a combination of, you can argue, and I can only really speculate based on of decisions Obama has made, but a combination of naivety or just, maybe not understanding the way the whole game was played, Obama hired Victoria Nuland, Robert Kagan's wife, to be in charge of extremely important policy position, policy making position in the State Department. So these are all things that I cover in part two. And if, in terms of like who are the main characters of these films, I would say part one, it's mostly Robert Kagan and Bill Kristol. And in part two, it's mostly focuses in on Victoria Nuland and kind of, instead of just showing sort of the behind the scenes inside baseball, the neocons talking amongst themselves, part two shows how their rhetoric gets filtered down into the mainstream media landscape and actually, creates immense damage in terms of what, how they can control the narrative just by inserting little talking points here and there. So yeah, that's part one and two, pretty much.
Yeah, when I started watching part one, and part one is interesting because it has no narration. Essentially, you are letting these people speak for themselves, which I think is a very clever thing. But what I was thinking when I was watching it is that you've succeeded in rescuing all of these little quotations, all these little interviews from the memory hole. Because the thing about the neocons is every day is a brand new day for them. They don't want you to know what they said yesterday because what they said yesterday was wrong. Iraq wasn't a cakewalk. All of these things didn't go smoothly. And so they never want you to go back and see these things. And that's what you captured with part one, which was great. But taking off on what you said earlier, here's something from the film. And you had Robert Kagan, I think he was on C-SPAN. And the one thing about the Kagans and Kristol even, these are not bomb-throwing types. They're actually very civilized, almost friendly types, and they have a way of bringing you on almost with a sort of charm. But here's what Kagan said, and this is from your film. What people call neoconservatives, I actually call mainstream bipartisan view. But the thing is, he's right in a way, and that is because, but that's only part of the story. He's right because the only view that is able to come through is the neocon view. When the TV is when Fox is looking for an expert, even MSNBC, CNN looking for an expert, they'll have someone like John McCain or Bill Kristol. These are the foreign policy experts. So they've been able to make something very extreme look very mainstream.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, what I found disturbing while making this film was that the neoconservatives not only have succeeded in making some of these ideas mainstream, I feel like the culture in DC in general has shifted more towards essentially the normalization of what is considered being a neoconservative. The word is almost considered anachronistic now. People don't use it anymore, and but I think that they're almost more influential right now than even possibly when they were in the Bush administration, because at least in the Bush administration, it was very clear to people, I'm assuming like you and Ron, to see that and to know these are neocons. We know who these people are. We know what they're trying to do. Now it's a little bit more confusing and things are more merged together, where there are a lot of people who seem centrist and who seem like I mean, one of the parts of part two that I focus on is these new neocons, sort of the new generation of journalists and people out there who are going around helping sort of the old school neocons, like people like Eli Lake who write for Bloomberg, and that's a whole new thing that's happening now. Is a lot of these journalists have a lot of credibility among younger people and younger intellectuals than someone like Bill Kristol or Robert Kagan.
Actually, that's when I knew that I wanted to talk to you and have you on the show, is when you brought out this point about the younger generation of neocons, because you're right, they're very media savvy. You look at someone like Michael Weiss, Eli Lake. You point out they're very savvy. They have the Daily Beast has a huge readership among young people, and they're also very aggressive. They're the older neocons, even the Kagans. Forget about the previous generation. Still had somewhat sort of an erudition about them. The new generation strikes me at least as more like attack dogs, and I noticed with some glee that escaped me as I was watching that you did focus a little on Jamie Couric, who I think encapsulates the idea of an attack dog neocon. You know, he is with the Foreign Policy Initiative, which you focus on a lot in the second film, And he is this sort of well-paid attack dog who does nothing but sit around looking for things to attack. And I remember when we opened the Ron Paul Institute back in 2013, it was either the day we opened or a day or two later, there he was firing out 1,500 words about how we're a bunch of kooks, conspiracy theorists, awful, don't listen to them, try to ignore them, stay away from them. So that was a very interesting and very important part of the film. It almost needs fleshed out more, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point you make. Part of the reason I didn't flesh it out more is because I didn't want to feed his ego. because he is, I mean, he does seem to almost thrive on that kind of negative attention. I almost see him as like a James O'Keefe style agitator for the neocons. He reminds me of, he has similar techniques, except the things that Jamie Couric is doing are meant to sort of appeal to liberals oftentimes. Mm-hmm. So like when he did the protest against the gay law on RT, he was doing that sort of under the guise of I'm a liberal activist, mm-hmm. when in reality he was a fellow at one of the most hardcore neoconservative think tanks on the planet.
And the agenda is to bash Russia no matter what.
Of course, yeah. And so that's what's interesting to me. And then you'll see other sort of triangulation efforts between him and his buddies in D.C., so, for example, after him and Ray McGovern went at it in an interview or in like a discussion together, he was kind of embarrassed afterwards because Ray McGovern, I think, made him look like a fool because of the things Jamie Couric was trying to smear him with. So Rosie Gray, a few weeks later on BuzzFeed, writes this hit piece on Ray McGovern, essentially calling him a racist and a conspiracy theorist. And I was thinking, isn't that convenient that one of Jamie Couric's friends writes his hit piece about Ray McGovern after Ray McGovern made Jamie look like a fool on live television.
That is actually very Soviet, isn't it? A popular front. The other thing that's interesting, and you don't necessarily get into this, although it's hinted at, and maybe you get into it in part 3, but I think it's so critical, is the issue of funding. And funding is how they dominate the agenda. You know, these organizations are enormously well funded. I think you had several clips from the Institute for the Study of War. And they portray themselves as a group of intellectuals, and they do have very good maps on Syria, I have to say. But it takes about 3 minutes to click through and find their supporters, and their supporters are Raytheon, probably Lockheed, but whatever. You sort of go down the whole list, they're all the military-industrial complex. So the neocons and the think tanks that they populate are sort of represent the merger of corporate, military-industrial complex and government money that's invested to create policy that then goes back and creates more money for them through new wars. So this is really a stranglehold on opinion, on public opinion. It strikes me as almost un-American.
No, it's absolutely ridiculous that these think tanks are, I mean, especially something like the Institute for Study of War, that is 100%, I think, funded by defense contractors. And they signal boost, constantly anything that could potentially involve the United States getting into like a new war. But the Institute for Study of War is specifically is probably one of the most like academic, nonpartisan seeming think tanks in D.C. that's all about war. But it's ran by Kimberly and Fred Kagan. Kimberly Kagan is, of course, the sister-in-law of Robert Kagan, and once again, in my movie, I show her being asked if she's a neocon, and she has that weird stock response that they all do, where she says, "I don't even know what that means anymore," completely plain dumb. And they do, and you mentioned their maps. I mean, their maps are pretty much the map that you see when it comes to like what the ongoing situation is in Iraq and Syria right now. The New York Times, pretty much every mainstream media outlet runs their maps. But the other side of it is that I find interesting is that the defense contractors, unlike a lot of other corporations, this form of lobbying that they do in the form of these neoconservative think tanks is a whole different animal than the type of lobbying that we normally see, where they actually have a whole intellectual class of people in D.C. who are not just helping them advertise, but writing like rationalizations and almost like an ideology to sort of get behind the weapons they're trying to sell, essentially.
Yeah, it's just blatant. And I remember when I was on the Hill with Dr. Paul, he would always have Fred Kagan coming in and sitting down as the great expert. There was never anyone, this was supposed to be, the Foreign Affairs Committee was supposed to be where you debate these issues and come up with some sort of a policy. It was only always one side. It was always Fred Kagan. He was always telling us how wonderful the surge was going to be in Iraq. And then when it happened, how wonderful the surge was in Iraq. And then afterward, how wonderful the surge is going to save things. He's not saying very much about that now. But we're going to have to, unfortunately, close in a bit. But I do want you, if you don't mind, to talk a little bit about Part 3, which is coming out, if I'm right, later this month. Give us a little bit of a preview, and then let people know where they can watch these films.
Well, you can watch all of them at averyheavyagenda.com. It takes you to links to Vimeo on demand. And right now we're actually running a special a freebie of Part 1. You can watch it on the website filmsforaction.org for free, starting yesterday and running the whole week until this coming Monday. So definitely check that out. I'll be releasing a commentary track for Part 1 fairly soon if you want to get some of the backstory on more details about the story in that one. But Part 3, I'm glad you brought up Fred Kagan again, because Part 3 closely follows sort of the rest of the Kagan family and what those people are doing, and then also the fathers of some of these neocons. So I go into the backstory of Irving Kristol. I cover Donald Kagan, and I discovered a clip that as far as I know, hasn't been posted anywhere else online. It was online to begin with, but it's part of like a long radio broadcast where on 9/12/2001, Don and Fred Kagan actually went on. Don and Fred Kagan actually went on a radio show and said that they want U.S. troops to invade Palestinian territories as a response to 9/11. Don Kagan also said on the same show that he believes that people are going to become complacent since they think 9/11 is a one-off, and what if the terrorists had anthrax on that plane? Now, keep in mind, this is 9/12, one day after 9/11. Before anybody knew that the anthrax attacks was happening, it didn't the the letters didn't get sent out until 9/18. So some very interesting things in this conversation, and he also makes some blatantly racist statements. He talks in this conversation about how Arabs only understand force, and he repeats this meme several times, which is something that neocons tried to hide and brush under the rug, that they actually are very racist in terms of the way that they view the Middle East. So those are all things I will be covering in Part 3.
That sounds great, and I really would urge people to go look at it. Even if you have to rent it, it's very reasonable, and it is definitely worth doing. So I want to thank you, Robbie, for joining us, and thanks for sharing this. Maybe when 3 is out, maybe we'll get together and talk about it again sometime. But thanks very much for joining us.
I'd love to. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thanks. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Please be sure to follow the Liberty Report on YouTube, youtube.com/Ron Paul Liberty Report. Subscribe to the show, and you'll get to see all of the things that we've done. We're going on 240 or so episodes. We do this every day, so please take the time to subscribe. And thank you again for joining us.